Don't forget to like and subscribe to stay up to date and help the channel grow. We really appreciate you spending some time with us today. And now, on with the show. You are listening to the Narrated, Not the Popular Opinion with the one and only Gray. Greetings, opinion nerds. It is I, the one they call Gray, and today we're getting sucked into the swirling vortex that is Disney's The Black Hole on this latest installment of Don't Look Back, coming up right now. Sometimes the gravity of a situation just plain sucks, opinion nerds. When I was a kid, I was a voracious sci-fi carnivore. My folks, especially my dad, loved science fiction and science fiction movies, and they shared that with me from a very young age. Those experiences shaped so much of my life, for better or worse, that I will always give deference to a work of science fiction, no matter how, let's say, questionable it might be. Being born in the mid-70s, I've seen a number of films try to replicate the cross-platform success of Star Wars, probably one of the most significant entries into modern American film culture, whether some like admitting it or not. TV series like Buck Rogers and Battlestar Galactica, the film and eventual TV revival of Star Trek, as well as other sci-fi and fantasy material came and went in an attempt to find the sweet spot between art and commerce to replicate both the social and, more importantly, monetary success of George Lucas's little space movie no one wanted to make. But in all my travels across the galaxies of film and television, one film had eluded me for one reason or another, though I could have sworn I'd seen it at some point. As it turns out, Disney's The Black Hole had long been, forgive me for saying, a big black hole in my catalog of film experiences, and I'd be lying if I could tell you why. Though the studios made the film available on home media since 1980, it was just never something that seemed important or interesting enough to look into. Maybe my child brain could tell from what little I had seen that the film wasn't going to be for me. Maybe it was because my parents, my lifeline to literally all things, never seemed interested in it. And by the time I was watching movies like The Terminator at the tender age of 9, The Black Hole just seemed like a childish artifact lost to time. Now that the film is so readily available on the Disney Plus streaming service, I felt it was time to correct this oversight. So with my strength and comfy blanket in place, I hit the engines and blasted off into cinematic space. The Black Hole had a troubled development rooted in the early 1970s disaster movie fad. After several stabs at creating something like The Towering Inferno or Airport in Space, Disney put the film on the shelf for a couple years until the 1977 release of Star Wars kicked off a cinematic space race with studios looking to cash in on the film's unexpected popularity. Like Paramount with Star Trek, Disney decided to dust off their own space epic, hoping to strike while the iron was still hot. The studio also had a slightly more ego-driven motivation, as it had passed on the opportunity to produce Star Wars and was still smarting from the loss of all that sweet merchandising money. It must be noted, though, that given their creative culture, if Disney had been involved in the production of Star Wars, it's unlikely the film would have turned out as it did. And no, this isn't some commentary on the current state of the Disney-owned franchise or anything like that. It's just a simple statement of fact. A change in the ingredients will always result in a different cake. Trying to grab their own sweet slice of that market, Disney wanted it all. Spaceships, talking robots, a melding of cutting-edge special effects with drama and pathos, asking big questions about the depths of human ambition, the universe, and our relationship with the unknown. They also wanted something Disney had never tried before, to make a mature film with a PG rating. This caused a not inconsequential amount of outrage at the time, which may seem ridiculous now, but one has to remember that the film rating system has changed pretty substantially over the last 40 years. At the time, PG was considered the median film rating, much like PG-13 is now. It It was a very broad category that excluded anything that wasn't specifically child or adult oriented. In 1979 alone, this included films like Rocky II, Escape from Alcatraz, Nosferatu the Vampire, and the Bond film Moonraker. All films which would surely receive at least a PG-13 rating these days. In fact, when it was announced the film was angling for that PG, some parents expressed concern about taking their kids to a Disney film and having their tender Mickey Mouse ears assaulted by the word fuck, which was a thing you could do in a PG film in the 1970s. Disney pulled out all the stops for the production to the tune of $20 million, which sat right between the $10 million budget for Star Wars and the $44 million budget for Star Trek The Motion Picture. They built enormous sets and hired some of the very best special effects technicians to work with their in-house teams. They built an all-new computer-controlled camera system and worked out a lot of practical effects to simulate zero gravity on set and create the hovering robots. They hired a strong cast of performers, including Anthony Perkins, Robert Forster, and Maximilian Schnell, along with Roddy McDowall and Slim Pickens to voice a duo of droids. They brought in consultants who had worked for NASA, including a former astronaut, to help make the scenes aboard ship feel more genuine. They hired a veteran director with a long history in television and even a couple of films under his belt. They also threw up their share of roadblocks as the screenplay continued to be adjusted and producers and directors went back and forth over the designs for the movie's more fantasy characters, hoping to find the line between not too scary and not too bland, something just right for selling action figures and printing on t-shirts. Disney threw resources into the black hole, determined to make it a big hit. They even moved the film out from under the Disney banner to release it through their Buena Vista distribution label in an attempt to assure audiences this was not to be confused with the family-friendly Disney they were used to. Unfortunately, all that effort did not generate the hoped-for return. The film released to middling reviews and underwhelming box office, taking in just under $36 million domestically. As a result, merchandising never really took off and proposed theme park tie-in ideas were scrapped. Though it found a bit of a second life on home video and has undergone somewhat of a critical reevaluation in recent years, the film's legacy was already set. I was surprised to realize how very little I had actually heard about the film over the years beyond the fact that it existed. A big production of a high-minded science fiction film, an attempt for a family-friendly studio to reach out to a more mature audience, award-winning effects artists working on an ambitiously creative project. This is the kind of thing I'm usually drawn to, but the scent just wasn't in the air. Now, I like to think of myself as someone who's willing to take a chance on films that are typically outside of my peripheral view, and had recently been rewarded by a screening of Return to Oz, another Disney film that faced many of the same issues but turned out to be a much better experience than its reviews would suggest. So I had to wonder, would The Black Hole be more of the same? Was it a misunderstood work of mature fantasy lost on an audience of children? Was it a film undone by its own ambitions, clashing with a studio that fundamentally misunderstood its intentions? Was The Black Hole Disney's answer to Kubrick's 2001, a film too ahead of its time for audiences to wrap their heads around? What I would discover is that, for all its efforts and intentions, The Black Hole was none of these things. In my most charitable assessment, The Black Hole is just not a very good film. I could spend a lot of time going over every little detail of the film I think falls short, but the reality of it is that director Nelson, for all those qualifications, was simply not up to the task of creating a compelling and engaging film experience. It would be easy to blame the special effects for not being convincing enough to sell the film, with its often sloppy blue screen work, obvious matte paintings, and visible on-set puppeteering often destroying the immersion, but the nuts and bolts of the issue is that Nelson just wasn't a filmmaker who could get inside the material and bring the audience with him. The film looks as if it was all shot with a single unidirectional spotlight. There doesn't seem to be any sense of intent behind the visual design, and there's very little visual continuity pulling it all together to make it all feel as if it exists with purpose in a unified world. The camera tracks and follows the characters as if simply putting images on the screen is enough to create engaging storytelling, while the plot just kind of clunks along dryly. I'm not suggesting the film is totally devoid of merit, as it does have some interesting ideas and the basic concept is solid. Everyone came in with the attempt to make a film with real dramatic weight that would end with a mind-blowing sequence of spectacle. And with all honesty, if this had been an animated film, we might be having a very different conversation. But live performance cinema requires a different level of believability and immersion to get through the screen to the audience, and from the screenplay to the cinematography, visual storytelling, and even the effects work the artists and technicians worked so hard on, this film just doesn't have what it takes to get the job done. Director Nelson should rightfully shoulder much of the responsibility, as he was in charge of developing and maintaining the vision for the film's final form and making sure that the materials being delivered were all crafted towards creating that experience. But the production didn't seem to have a goal for the storytelling to reach, to the point that the screenplay had no resolution. In the end, the production tossed the cast into a set that spun them around like a blender, stitched together some vaguely thematically related ideas, and hoped that what resulted would be visually impressive enough that the audience wouldn't notice none of it communicated anything. With no story being told, the film relies on the visceral power of spectacle alone to create an experience, but that would have required a much more subjective, kinetic, and heightened direction than Nelson was able to provide. Beyond that, either no one else in the hierarchy of the production, from the editor to the studio, seemed to grasp how lifeless the film was, or they figured what they were getting was as good as it was going to be, and after almost a decade in development hell and millions in production costs, it was better to put out what they had than end up releasing nothing at all. I'm very comfortable with the idea that not every movie will appeal to me, so I have no problem making statements like, I get it, it's well produced, it's just not my bag. It isn't very often that I find myself watching a film and remarking out loud, wow, this is terrible. But such was the profoundness of my experience with The Black Hole. Even my attempts to place myself in the shoes of someone watching the film in 1979 just to maintain some sense of perspective failed me, because Star Wars was a thing that had just happened and did everything The Black Hole was attempting to do much better, because from the start, that film knew what it was and what experience it wanted to create. For all its investment in time and money, the best The Black Hole was able to muster was the impression of it being a very expensive B-movie whose ambitions simply outstripped the abilities of everyone involved in making it. This is not a misunderstood piece of highbrow cinema masquerading as genre schlock, and if anything, the critical reevaluation is giving more deference to its intentions than the resulting film earns. In looking over some research material, it turns out that while I was correct that I hadn't seen the film as a child, I did own a copy of the read-along book and record, Kids Ask Your Grandparents What That Is, which is why the image of the robots is so deeply etched in my mind. But while there is a certain amount of nostalgia for that faded print cover, I have none for the film itself, and so I feel that I'm able to look at it with a very clear mind. The simple fact is that The Black Hole didn't collapse on itself for any reason other than it's just not a very good movie. Sure, it has some flashes of something compelling every now and then, but that's all pulled down by a studio trying to have it both ways in creating a work of mature science fiction and a vehicle for selling toys and pajamas to kids. It's a transition the studio would attempt for a few more years, leading to films like The Black Cauldron, Tron, Return to Oz, and even to some extent Willow. All films which seem to suffer from the same issue, in that the culture of what Disney is, not only as a brand but as a perspective on creating entertainment, is in many ways incompatible with creating the kind of entertainment experiences these films were aiming for. It's why they bought Marvel and Lucasfilm. It was an attempt to buy their way into a market they'd been unsuccessful in cracking for years. Unfortunately, it looks like the absorption of those entities into the Disney family is beginning to result in a little too much of the Disney culture rubbing off on them in the wrong way. As a lover of science fiction films, I feel like it was almost a duty that I see this movie, and I was really interested in seeing if it was the unpolished gem I'd heard it was. But once I experienced the very great Anthony Perkins' straight-faced utter the line, "You'll be remembered as one of the greatest space scientists in history," I knew the chances of things getting better were pretty slim. I'm more than certain everyone involved had the best of intentions and really thought they were going to be pushing the envelope in some way, but things just didn't quite come together, and ultimately I think it was the lack of a singular artistic voice to guide it that was its undoing. Director Nelson did his best to give the studio what they wanted, but the reality is the studio didn't know what they wanted, and Nelson didn't know how to give it to them. So instead they got what they asked for, a hodgepodge of ideas stitched together by a screenplay that never had a real ending, resulting in a film that had no real perspective and nothing to say. The Black Hole surely has its supporters, just as I'll go to the mat for a movie like Tron, a film I know isn't great but appeals to me anyway. But even in that case, I can make a distinction between the film being important and the film being good in the context of delivering on its creative intentions. The Black Hole may be an important film in the history of Disney, but beyond that, it serves as little more than a minor footnote in the annals of science fiction filmmaking, overshadowed by films that did it bigger and did it better. As a kid, I would have undoubtedly looked at the film with a different perspective, but that wouldn't have changed what the film was. Disney's attempt to hop onto two different fads that ended up missing the train on both. But you have to admire the studio being willing to risk failure to push themselves to the further reaches of the creative space. And if they had just managed to keep going, who knows what they would have found? If there's one lesson that can be taken from the Black Hole story, it's that when you're caught in the gravitational well of the unknown, sometimes the only way out is through. This has been the Narrated, Not the Popular Opinion. As always, I have been Gray, and if you like what you heard, you can leave a tip at our Ko-Fi page at ko-fi.com/notthepopularopinion. You can follow us on Twitter at @only_Gray, and don't forget our main page at notthepopularopinion.wordpress.com, where you'll find more great articles just like this. Thanks again for listening, and remember, if you're as good to others as you are to yourself, we might just make it through this mess. See ya.